The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting golden streaks through the towering pines that framed the Richardson family's backyard. It was the kind of afternoon that made time slow, where the world felt safe and simple. Daniel sat at the wooden patio table, his fingers absently tapping the rim of his iced tea glass as he watched his daughters, Emma, 8, and Lily, 7, chase each other barefoot across the freshly mowed grass. Their laughter rang through the air, mingling with the soft rustling of the trees. Across from him, Laura unwrapped a set of sandwiches, carefully cutting them into neat halves. The scent of toasted bread and melted cheese filled the air as she glanced at her husband with a warm, knowing smile. They rarely had moments like this, just the four of them, away from the endless pull of work emails and household obligations. But that moment, that perfect, fleeting second of peace, was about to shatter. A strange stillness settled over the backyard. It was subtle at first, the way the wind seemed to pause, how the birds that had been chirping just seconds ago fell silent all at once. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Daniel's fingers curled instinctively against the cool glass in his hand. It was a sensation he couldn't quite place, a flicker of unease at the back of his mind, a sense of something watching. And then, from the dense tree line at the far end of the yard, it emerged. A massive black bear. It was unlike anything they had ever seen up close before, a shadow of sheer muscle and fur, stepping forward from the undergrowth with a slow, deliberate movement. Its dark eyes scanned the yard, the table, the children. A beat of silence. Then, Lily saw it first. Her little hands froze mid-air, still clutching a juice box. The straw slipped from her lips, and her face paled as her blue eyes locked onto the enormous creature. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Then Emma turned, following her sister's gaze. Then Laura. Then Daniel. And just like that, their peaceful backyard lunch became a living nightmare. Laura snatched both girls by the arms in a movement so fast it nearly knocked over the picnic basket. Emma let out a small gasp as her mother's nails dug into her wrist. Inside. Now. Her voice was sharp, but barely above a whisper, as if she was afraid that even speaking too loudly would invite disaster. Daniel's pulse slammed against his ribs. His breath turned shallow, and his grip on the armrest of his chair tightened until his knuckles turned white. Every muscle in his body screamed for action, but his mind had no roadmap for what to do next. He had read about bear encounters. Stay still. Don't run. Don't make eye contact. But none of those articles had prepared him for this. For his daughter's standing frozen just feet away from a wild predator. The bear took another step forward. Its paws made no sound against the grass, but Daniel felt each step as if the earth trembled beneath them. Its breathing was heavy, deep, rhythmic. Close enough now that they could see the way its fur bristled slightly in the warm breeze. Close enough to see that something was wrong. The bear wasn't moving with the predatory grace he had expected. There was no sudden charge, no show of aggression. It was limping. A faint but unmistakable wound gleamed near its shoulder, a gash deep enough to mat the dark fur with blood. A wild bear should not have been here. Not this close to humans. Not with a wound like that. Yet it had come anyway. Emma's lip quivered as she clutched at Laura's waist. Is it? The bear's head snapped up. Laura's breath hitched. Daniel's heart stopped. It had heard them. For a split second, time itself collapsed. The girls clung to their mother, their tiny fingers curled into her shirt like lifelines. Daniel's mind raced, already calculating how fast he could get to them, how fast he could pull them into the house before. And then, something happened that no one expected. The bear collapsed. Not lunging, not charging. It simply fell. A thick, heavy sound as its massive body crashed onto the grass, legs folding beneath it like a puppet with its strings cut. A thick gasp filled the silence, Laura's, as she clutched her chest, disbelief flooding her face. Daniel's muscles locked in place, every nerve telling him to run, but his feet refused to move. What was this? What was happening? The bear let out a low, broken exhale. Not a growl. Not a roar. Something weaker. Something that shouldn't have come from a creature this powerful. Emma took a hesitant step forward. Daddy, is it sick? Daniel's breath felt like ice in his throat. He had spent his entire life believing that nature was untamed, indifferent, and that wild creatures did not seek humans unless driven by hunger or desperation. And yet, as he looked at the massive bear lying helpless in their yard, its ribs rising and falling in uneven shudders, something inside him whispered a truth he couldn't ignore. This wasn't an attack. It was something else entirely. Something that was about to change everything. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the kind that curled around the edges of fear, wrapping itself so tightly around the air that even the wind seemed hesitant to move. Laura could hear her own heartbeat, rapid and pounding, a drum against her ribcage. The world, just seconds ago so normal, so familiar, now felt foreign, fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. Daniel was still frozen in place, his legs locked in an instinctual paralysis, his mind cycling through options too quickly to settle on any one of them. His wife and daughters stood only a few feet away, but in this moment they felt impossibly distant. The bear's body, dark and enormous, lay still in the grass, its heaving breaths barely audible. And yet, it was still alive. Laura's grip tightened around the girl's wrists. Emma and Lily weren't crying, but they were shaking. Their little fingers dug into her skin, not out of pain, but sheer, unfiltered fear. They had never seen an animal this big outside of a zoo, let alone one so terrifyingly close, so undeniably real. The barrier between safety and the wild had never felt thinner. Daniel inhaled sharply, his senses sharpening as his training, his knowledge, his instincts, all clashed against one another in a war of reason and emotion. His first thought was to get his family inside. But every nerve in his body was screaming, what if? What if they moved too fast? What if the bear wasn't as weak as it seemed? What if this was a trap? No. That didn't make sense. Bears didn't behave like this. They were unpredictable, yes, dangerous, of course, but this wasn't aggression. The bear had collapsed, not lunged. It had made no move to threaten them. And yet, it was still there. Breathing. Watching. Then, the bear twitched. It was small, a shift in its massive frame, but it was enough. Emma gasped. Lily let out a sharp, strangled whimper. Laura's entire body turned rigid. Daniel's muscles tensed, his mind screaming for action, but which action? His thoughts fired off in rapid succession. Get the girls inside. Don't run. Don't provoke it. Is it injured? Call for help. But what if help doesn't come in time? The bear shifted again, this time a little more. It let out a noise, not quite a growl, but something deeper. A low, guttural sound that set ice crawling through Daniel's veins. And then it lifted its head. For the first time, their eyes met. And what Daniel saw wasn't what he expected. There was no rage in those deep, dark irises. No hunger. No violence. Just exhaustion. A slow, sinking kind of weariness, the kind that spoke of something more than just fatigue. It was the same look he had seen in stranded animals before, and creatures caught in the wake of disasters. A look that spoke of desperation. Of something bigger than pain, something closer to surrender. And that terrified him more than anything else. The realization struck him like a thunderclap, this bear wasn't here by accident. Something had brought it here, to them. Laura must have sensed something too, because her voice, usually so strong, so certain, came out small and shaking. Daniel, she whispered, barely audible. What is it doing? Daniel couldn't answer. His throat had gone dry, his brain scrambling for words that simply didn't exist. Then, suddenly, the bear tried to stand. A sharp inhale cut through the air, Laura's. Emma buried her face into her mother's waist, clutching at her sweater with white-knuckled hands. The massive creature trembled as it pressed its weight against the ground, its thick paws digging into the earth. Every muscle in its body shook violently, its limbs buckling under its own mass. It was struggling. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't charging. It was fighting to survive. Daniel's fingers twitched at his side. Every instinct in him told him to move, to act, to protect. But from what? From an animal that had no strength left to fight? From something that wasn't a predator in this moment, but a victim? The bear collapsed again. This time, the sound was heavier. Final. A deep, shuddering breath escaped from its snout, and for a moment, Daniel thought, feared, it might not breathe again. The wind shifted, carrying the distant scent of pine and damp earth, but there was something else in the air now. Something invisible. Something unspoken. And then, a sound from the woods. It was faint. So quiet, so fragile, that Daniel almost convinced himself it was the wind. Until he heard it again. A sound that shouldn't have existed in this moment. A whimper. A tiny, barely there noise. Not from the bear. From something else. Daniel's pulse spiked. He turned sharply, eyes locking onto the tree line, scanning the darkened shadows between the towering trunks. And that's when he saw it. A second shape. Smaller. Unsteady. Just at the edge of the clearing. The pieces clicked together in his mind before he could even fully process them. The bear wasn't alone. And now, everything made sense. The sound had been so faint at first, so fragile, that Daniel almost dismissed it as nothing more than the whisper of the wind moving through the towering trees. But when it came again, a soft, high-pitched whimper, raw and full of desperation, he knew. This wasn't the wind. This was something else. Something small. Something alive. His body moved before his mind could catch up. His eyes locked onto the tree line, narrowing through the shifting shadows of the dense Montana forest. And then he saw it. A second shape. Much smaller. Shaking. A cub. The realization hit him like a gut punch. His breath caught in his throat, his fingers tightening involuntarily at his sides. His brain was screaming at him, trying to process the information faster than his heart could handle it. The bear, this massive, wounded mother lying helpless in their backyard, wasn't alone. She had a baby. And that baby was calling for her. Daniel's stomach twisted into a knot so tight he thought he might be sick. The entire situation had just shifted. What had moments ago been a dangerous, unpredictable encounter between a wild animal and a human family was now something entirely different. This wasn't just a bear collapsing in exhaustion. This was a mother fighting to get to her child. The wind picked up again, rustling the tall grass, and the cub, God, it was so small, stumbled forward, its legs weak, its fur damp with what Daniel prayed was just dew and not something far worse. It let out another cry. Soft. Helpless. Laura gasped audibly behind him. He heard the small, sharp intake of breath that meant she had just put the pieces together too. A quick glance over his shoulder confirmed it. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with something more than fear. Empathy. Daniel turned back toward the cub. He felt his chest tighten at the sight of it. The way it wobbled slightly as it moved forward, the way its tiny body swayed with each unsure step. It was starving. He could see that now, with the way its ribs pressed against its skin beneath that thick coat of fur. How long had it been out here? How long had it been waiting for its mother to return? His eyes flickered back to the mother bear. She hadn't moved. Her body was still stretched out across the grass, her limbs splayed, her chest barely rising and falling with each breath. If she was aware of her cub, she made no sign of it. Daniel swallowed hard. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. The cub let out another whimper, this time more frantic. It stepped forward again, but its movements were growing slower. The tremble in its legs more pronounced. Its tiny frame was exhausted, desperate. Daniel could feel his own heart pounding now, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a vice. Every instinct, every rational thought in his head was screaming at him to get his family inside. To shut the door. To call for help and let professionals handle this. But there was no time for that. The cub wouldn't make it much longer. And the mother. His throat tightened. She was dying. He could see it now, the slow decline, the labored breaths, the way her body had simply given up. This wasn't just exhaustion. This was something worse. Something fatal. The realization crushed him. His legs suddenly felt weak beneath him, his hands clammy. He had spent his entire life believing that nature was harsh, that it had no room for sentiment. Animals survived, or they didn't. That was just how the world worked. But this was something else. This was a mother who had dragged herself to the very edge of human civilization, against every survival instinct ingrained in her body, because she had no other choice. Because she was trying, with every last ounce of strength she had left, to reach her cub. And she had failed. Daniel felt something break inside him. He exhaled shakily, his eyes flicking back to the cub. It had stopped moving. His pulse spiked. No, 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 not now. The tiny creature swayed on its feet, its ears twitching, its body shivering violently against the cold that wasn't even that cold. Not for a bear. Not unless it was dying. Daniel took a step forward. A small one. Barely perceptible. But it was enough. Behind him, Laura sucked in a breath. "Daniel," she whispered, voice trembling. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. Because he didn't know. All he knew was that there was a dying baby bear in front of him. And that its mother, a mother who had fought through God only knew what kind of suffering just to get here, had given up everything to try and save it. But she wouldn't be able to. She wouldn't make it. She wasn't going to get back up. It was up to him now. Daniel's fingers curled into fists. Everything in his head was screaming at him to stop. That this was stupid. That this was reckless. That this was a wild animal and he was just a man standing in his backyard trying to make sense of something too big to understand. But his heart had already made the choice. The cub's tiny body trembled violently as it tried, and failed, to take another step. It let out a small, weak noise, a sound that made Daniel's chest tighten so hard it nearly crushed him. And in that moment, he knew. There was no going back. What he was about to do would change everything. The sound cut through the stillness like a fragile thread unraveling in the wind. A sound so small, so heartbreakingly weak, that for a moment, Daniel thought his mind had conjured it, some cruel trick of the brain, desperate to make sense of the impossible. But then it came again. A soft, desperate cry. Not human. Not wind. Not an illusion. A cub. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, his heart slamming against his ribs as his eyes snapped toward the tree line. He could barely see it at first, its tiny frame blending into the tangled brush, a shadow within the shadows. But then, as the clouds above shifted, a sliver of moonlight slipped through the dense canopy, illuminating the form of the smallest, most fragile creature he had ever seen. The cub was barely standing. Its little legs trembled beneath its weight, its fur, once thick and protective, now damp, matted, and clinging to a frame that was too thin, too fragile for something that was supposed to be strong. It let out another cry. A sound so helpless, so piercingly raw, that Daniel felt his entire body stiffen with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Not fear. Not even shock. Something deeper. Something that gripped him in a way he couldn't explain. Behind him, Laura gasped. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. Emma and Lily clung to her sides, their little faces peeking from behind her, their wide, innocent eyes reflecting something they had never known before. Suffering. The kind that wasn't distant, wasn't happening on a television screen, but right in front of them. Real. Immediate. unfolding in their own backyard. The mother bear still hadn't moved. Daniel swallowed hard. His gaze flickered between the cub and its mother, his mind desperately trying to bridge the impossible gap between them. The bear had dragged herself here. Through pain, through exhaustion, through something far worse than he could imagine. She had fought against every instinct, against every shred of fear that should have sent her fleeing in the opposite direction. Because she had to. Because something, someone, was waiting for her. But she hadn't made it in time. Daniel clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of the realization settle over him like a suffocating fog. She had collapsed just short of reaching her baby. Just short of saving it. The cub let out another whimper, its tiny body swaying unsteadily, as if it were balancing on the edge of existence itself. Too weak. Too hungry. Too cold. And its mother, the one thing that could have saved it, lay unmoving on the ground, her chest barely rising, her breath nearly lost to the night. Daniel felt something deep, something primal stir inside him. The kind of feeling that overrides logic, that obliterates rational thought, that screams louder than the voice of caution. His feet moved before his brain could catch up. Daniel. Laura's voice was sharp with panic, but distant, muted, as if it came from another world entirely. He barely heard her, barely registered the frantic edge in her tone. Because all he could see now was the cub. It was failing. Its head drooped forward, its tiny paws barely gripping the earth beneath it. Another second. Maybe two. That's all it had left. Daniel didn't think. He couldn't. Because if he thought, if he hesitated, if he stopped to weigh the risks, the consequences, he would be too late. So he took the first step. And then another. And another. The space between him and the dying cub disappeared in a blur of movement, the sound of his heartbeat drowning out everything else. He knelt. Slowly. Carefully. Close enough to feel the cub's shallow breaths, close enough to see the slight rise and fall of its fragile chest. Close enough to understand, fully, painfully, what was happening. It was losing the fight. The realization hit him so hard it nearly broke him. This tiny creature, this baby, had spent its last remaining energy trying to reach its mother. It had walked until it couldn't anymore. It had cried until its voice had gone hoarse. It had believed. And now, in this moment, it was letting go. Daniel couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. A decision formed in his chest, in his bones, in the very fabric of who he was. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was impossible. And yet, it was the only thing he could do. With one final, desperate breath, he reached forward, his hands shaking, his heart racing, and touched the cub. It flinched. A small, barely there reaction. But it was something. Daniel exhaled, his fingers pressing gently into the cub's damp fur, feeling the slight warmth still left beneath the cold. It was alive. For now. Behind him, he heard Laura choke back a sob. Emma whispered, "Daddy?" Lily whimpered, her tiny voice barely carrying in the night. Is it gonna be okay?" Daniel didn't answer. Because he didn't know. All he knew was that he had already made his choice. The cub was not going to die here. Not alone. Not when its mother had fought so hard, had given everything to reach it. Not when Daniel had the chance to do something. Something that, deep in his gut, he knew would change everything. The cub stirred slightly, its small body pressing just a little more into his hand. Daniel held his breath. And then, from behind him, a sound that made his entire body freeze. A sound that sent a cold shiver racing down his spine. Not from the cub. Not from the forest. Not from the wind. From behind him. From the mother bear. A low, shuddering breath. And then. Movement. The air was thick with tension, a suffocating weight that pressed against Daniel's chest, making each breath feel shallow and uncertain. Time had lost all meaning. Moments stretched into eternity as he knelt there, his trembling hand still cradling the fragile body of the cub. The tiny creature had stopped whimpering. Its breaths were slow, almost too slow, its small frame barely rising and falling against Daniel's palm. Its fur was damp with cold and exhaustion, the once soft and dense coat now matted and clinging to its frail body. Too weak. Too far gone. And yet, it was still alive. Daniel's grip tightened ever so slightly, as if he could somehow anchor the cub to this world through sheer will alone. But will wasn't enough. Not anymore. Behind him, Laura's voice cracked with emotion. "Daniel, we have to do something." Her words trembled, thick with an urgency that mirrored the storm raging inside him. She had been the one pleading caution before, the one who had gripped their daughters tightly, instinctively shielding them from the wild thing sprawled across their backyard. But now she was the one begging for action. Because she had seen it too. She had seen the way the mother bear had collapsed, her body shutting down after what must have been an unbearable fight for survival. She had seen the way the cub had struggled, its tiny limbs failing it, the light in its eyes flickering like a flame starved of oxygen. And she had seen what it would mean if they did nothing. Daniel swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he adjusted his grip on the cub, careful, so painfully careful, as if any wrong move might break the fragile creature apart. "What do I do?" he whispered. It wasn't a question for Laura. It wasn't a question for anyone, really. Because there was no right answer. In every wildlife guide he had ever read, and every documentary he had ever watched, the rule was always the same: never interfere. Never insert yourself into nature's course. The strong survived. The weak perished. That was the way of the world. But now, staring down at this helpless, gasping cub, feeling the faint heat of its tiny body against his palms, watching the way it shivered violently despite the mild summer air, Daniel realized something with an aching certainty. He couldn't live with that rule. Not now. Not this time. Because this wasn't just some detached, theoretical scenario playing out on a TV screen. This was happening in his backyard. This was a living, breathing creature dying in his hands. And if he let it slip away, if he just sat there and watched it happen, he knew he would never forgive himself. His daughters would never forgive him. Because Emma and Lily were watching. Wide-eyed. Silent. Fragile. They weren't crying. They weren't speaking. But their little hands were clutching onto Laura's sweater so tightly that their knuckles had turned white. And Daniel understood. They were waiting for him. Waiting to see what their father would do. Waiting to learn if this world, their world, was one where compassion mattered. Or if it was just as cruel and indifferent as the laws of nature dictated. He exhaled sharply, his mind screaming at him to make a choice. Then, a sound cut through the night. A sound that sent a chill crawling up his spine. A deep, guttural exhale. From behind him. From the mother bear. Daniel's body went rigid. For a long, terrifying moment, he thought she was dead. But then, another breath. Labored. Strained. But unmistakably alive. Daniel's heart stopped and restarted all at once. His eyes flickered toward her, taking in every painful detail. She hadn't moved. But her nostrils flared. Her massive chest rose and fell, weakly, unevenly, but with effort. And then, her eyes opened. Dark. Deep. Endless. They locked onto him instantly. Daniel felt a sharp, primal fear slice through him. He knew what a bear's gaze could mean. He knew that eye contact could be interpreted as a challenge. He knew that injured animals were the most unpredictable. And yet, there was no aggression in her stare. No rage. No primal, territorial fury. Just something else. Something ancient. Something Daniel couldn't name. She didn't move. Didn't growl. Didn't even blink. She just watched. And that was when Daniel understood. She wasn't here to fight. She wasn't here to defend herself. She was watching him hold her cub, watching to see what he would do. And somehow, in that eerie, impossible moment, he knew. She was trusting him. A wild, wounded creature. A mother who had fought against the limits of her body to reach this place. She was looking at him and waiting. Daniel felt something inside him shift. Something deep and unexplainable. A decision formed in his chest, unshakable, undeniable. He looked back at the tiny cub in his hands. Its breath hitched. Its body curled slightly closer to his palm, seeking warmth, seeking safety. And Daniel knew. He couldn't let it die. Not like this. Not when its mother had given everything to save it. Not when, against every instinct, against every rule, she had placed her final hope in him. His breath came out slow and heavy. His hands curled protectively around the cub's fragile body. And as the weight of the moment settled over him completely, drowning out everything else, he realized something bone-deep and irreversible. His life would never be the same again. The weight of the moment pressed down on Daniel's chest like a vice. The cub, fragile and trembling, barely clung to life in his hands. Every breath it took was a fight, every shallow rise and fall of its tiny body a battle against the inevitable. And yet, it was still here. Still holding on. The mother bear had not moved. She remained sprawled in the grass, her massive frame still and unmoving except for the slow, ragged rhythm of her breaths. But her eyes remained locked on him. Dark, unfathomable. Watching. Waiting. The way she looked at him made something deep inside him fracture. Because she wasn't just watching, she was pleading. Not with growls, not with bared teeth or primal rage. With silence. With trust. Daniel had never seen anything like it. A wild creature, one of the most powerful predators in the forest, lying on the edge of death, watching a human cradle her baby. She should be furious. She should be fighting. But instead, she had surrendered to something beyond instinct. And Daniel knew, without a doubt, what she was asking. She was asking him to save her child. The realization left him breathless. His hands curled protectively around the cub, his mind a whirlwind of fear, doubt, and something deeper, something ancient and unshakable. He had no idea what to do. But what choice did he have? The cub let out a weak, pitiful cry in his hands, a sound so fragile it sent an ache crawling up his throat. It was barely there, a whisper of life, slipping through his fingers. It was too cold. Too weak. And if he just stood here, if he hesitated for even a second longer, it would be gone. Panic flared in his chest. He had to do something. Now. Laura's voice trembled behind him. Daniel. He turned sharply, his eyes meeting hers. There was fear in them, God, there was so much fear. But there was something else too. Something that broke him even more than the bear's silent plea. Hope. She was terrified. But she wasn't stopping him. And when he looked down at Emma and Lily, their small hands clutching at their mother's sweater, their eyes glassy with something they didn't fully understand yet but knew was important, he realized something with a final, crushing certainty. They were watching him. Waiting. Just like the bear. Just like the cub. Waiting to see if he was the kind of man who would walk away. Or the kind who would fight. The wind picked up, rustling the trees around them, and Daniel let out a sharp breath, forcing his body to move before his mind could catch up. With steady hands, he pulled his jacket from his shoulders and wrapped the cub in the thick fabric. It let out a soft, barely audible sound as it pressed into the warmth, its tiny body curling into itself like it had just been given permission to exist for a little longer. Daniel tightened his grip. And then, slowly, carefully, he stood. The mother bear's eyes never left him. Even as her breathing grew more labored, even as her body shuddered against the weight of her own exhaustion, she never once looked away. She was trusting him. A part of Daniel wanted to believe she understood, that she knew he wouldn't let her baby die. But as he took a step back, as the distance between them grew, he couldn't shake the horrible, suffocating thought that this might be the last time she saw her child. And yet, she didn't stop him. Not with growls. Not with movement. She just watched. And Daniel swore, in that impossible moment, there was gratitude in her eyes. The lump in his throat threatened to choke him. "Daniel," Laura whispered again. "What are you doing?" He turned toward her, his grip tightening around the cub as if letting go would shatter him. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw, broken. And that was the truth. He had no idea what he was doing. He had no idea if this was the right thing, if stepping in would help or only make things worse. But he knew one thing. If he walked away now, if he left this tiny, dying creature to fate, he would never be able to live with himself. The world had enough indifference, enough cruelty. And maybe, just maybe, tonight didn't have to be another chapter in that story. Maybe tonight, compassion could win. His chest tightened. He looked at Laura, then at his daughters, who were still watching him with wide, unblinking eyes. And he realized they were waiting for his answer. Not in words. In action. So he made his choice. And as he turned, holding the cub against his chest, stepping toward the only chance it had left, he knew there was no turning back. Daniel's heartbeat hammered in his chest, his pulse drumming against his temples as he stepped toward the house, the cub wrapped tightly in his jacket. The weight of the tiny creature was barely noticeable in his arms, but the gravity of the moment crushed him like an avalanche. The night air was thick with uncertainty, wrapping around him like an unseen force, whispering doubts into the corners of his mind. Behind him, the mother bear lay still in the grass, her dark, weary eyes locked onto him with something that felt too human to ignore. She didn't move. She didn't growl. She just watched. Her breaths were shallow now, her powerful body barely clinging to its own strength. Every inhale looked like a battle. Every exhale felt like a surrender. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. Was he doing the right thing? Would taking the cub away help it? Would the mother be there when, if, he brought it back? He didn't know. But he couldn't leave it out here to die. The cub stirred weakly in his arms, its small, delicate body shifting closer to his chest, as if it could sense the warmth radiating from him. The sound it made, a soft, barely there murmur, clawed at something deep inside him, something primal, something beyond logic. It was helpless. It was trusting him. And Daniel had never felt more terrified. Behind him, Laura stood frozen in the doorway, her arms wrapped around Emma and Lily, her eyes wide with an emotion somewhere between fear and awe. She didn't speak. Neither did the girls. They simply stood there, watching, their small faces pale against the dim glow of the porch light. They had never seen their father like this. They had never seen anyone like this. Daniel reached the steps and paused. His hands, steady yet trembling, adjusted the jacket around the cub, shielding it from the cool night air. Its breathing was weak, its tiny ribs pressing against the fabric with each fragile inhale. If he hesitated much longer, it might not have another breath left to take. He stepped inside. The warmth of the house hit him like a wall, the sudden contrast making him dizzy. The familiar scent of home, wood, fabric softener, something faintly sweet from the remnants of dinner, clashed with the scent of the wild still clinging to his skin. He moved quickly, instinct taking over where logic failed. The living room was quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background the only sound breaking the heavy silence. He lowered himself onto the couch, placing the bundled cub on his lap with the care of a father holding his newborn child for the first time. Laura hovered near the door, hesitant, her fingers still gripping the fabric of Emma's sleeve. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "What do we do?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. He had no idea. He wasn't a veterinarian. He wasn't a wildlife expert. He was just a man who couldn't watch something suffer and do nothing. The cub let out a faint noise, its tiny body curling tighter into itself. It was cold. Daniel acted without thinking. He reached for the nearest blanket, a soft, worn one that had been draped over the armrest, and carefully tucked it around the cub, his hands moving gently, cautiously, as if any wrong movement might break it. Laura took a hesitant step forward. "Daniel." Her voice was softer this time, less fearful, more uncertain. She wasn't stopping him. She wasn't telling him to put it back outside. She was asking. Because even she knew, this wasn't just an animal. This was something more. Something fragile. Something that wasn't supposed to be in their hands, and yet, somehow, was. Daniel looked at her, his throat dry, his mind still spinning in 1,000 directions at once. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw. He shook his head, staring down at the cub, at the way it barely moved, barely breathed. "I just couldn't leave it out there." Laura's lips parted, as if she wanted to argue, wanted to remind him that this was dangerous, that they had no idea what they were getting into. But she didn't. Because she had seen the mother. She had seen the way it looked at him. She had seen the way it let him take its baby. And she understood. Emma took a small step forward, her voice tiny, hesitant. "Is it gonna die?" Daniel felt that question like a knife. He didn't answer right away. He couldn't. Instead, he reached out and brushed his fingers against the cub's fur, feeling the faintest flicker of warmth still lingering beneath the cold. It was weak. So weak. But it was alive. For now. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Daniel looked at his daughter, at the way her small hands clutched at her mother's sweater, her eyes filled with something she didn't fully understand yet. And he made her a promise. "I'm gonna try," he said, his voice firm. "I'm gonna try to help it." Emma nodded slowly, as if she had never believed anything more in her life. And as Daniel tightened the blanket around the cub, feeling its small body press against his palms in search of warmth, he realized something with a clarity that shook him to his core. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about something deeper. Something that tied them together, not just him and the cub, but him and the mother bear still lying outside, fighting against the inevitable. It was about trust. And Daniel had no intention of breaking it. Not now. Not ever. But as he sat there, watching over the tiny creature in his lap, he knew this was only the beginning. And what came next would change everything. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, pressing against the walls, filling every empty space with the unspoken. Daniel sat on the couch, unmoving, the small bundle of fur still tucked against his chest. He could feel the cub's tiny heartbeat, faint and uneven, a fragile rhythm barely tethered to life. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting warm, trembling shadows across the room. Outside, beyond the thin veil of glass that separated civilization from the wild, the mother bear remained motionless in the grass. Laura stood by the kitchen counter, arms wrapped around herself as if that could hold her together. Emma and Lily sat cross-legged on the rug, their wide, unblinking eyes fixed on their father and the fragile life he cradled in his arms. No one spoke. Because no one knew what to say. Daniel had never felt more helpless. He had spent his entire life believing that there was a right way and a wrong way to handle things. That every problem had a solution, that logic and action could fix anything. But this wasn't something that could be solved with a well-reasoned plan or a calculated risk. This was something else. This was a life slipping through his fingers. And all he could do was hope. The cub stirred weakly in his arms, a soft, barely there movement. Daniel tightened his grip instinctively, his hands adjusting to keep the small body secure, as if holding on tighter could somehow anchor it to this world. It was warmer now, not warm enough, but better. The blanket wrapped around it was doing something, though its shivering hadn't stopped completely. Daniel exhaled, his fingers grazing over the cub's fur, feeling the rise and fall of its breaths. Too shallow. Too uneven. Too close to stopping. He clenched his jaw, pushing down the weight pressing against his chest. He wasn't going to lose it. Not after everything. Not when it had fought so hard. Not when its mother was still out there, waiting. The thought made his stomach clench. She was still there. Still watching. Through the window, he could see her massive form in the dim glow of the porch light. She hadn't moved since Daniel had taken her cub into the house. She could have. She could have tried to get up, to follow, to fight for it. But she hadn't. Because she had given him something instead. Trust. And the weight of that realization was almost too much to bear. Daniel had never been religious. He had never been the kind of man to believe in things he couldn't see, couldn't explain. But this felt like something beyond reason. This felt like a mother giving the last of herself for her child. And putting her faith in him to finish what she couldn't. His throat tightened. She had chosen him. Not by accident. Not by desperation. By instinct. She had come here, to this house, to these people, because somewhere deep inside, in a place untouched by fear or hesitation, she had known. She had known they would help. Daniel swallowed hard, blinking against the heat behind his eyes. He didn't deserve that kind of trust. But he wouldn't waste it. Slowly, carefully, he adjusted his hold on the cub, shifting so that its tiny body was closer to the warmth of his chest. The movement stirred something in it. A weak, feeble noise escaped its throat, so soft it almost wasn't there. Emma sucked in a breath. "Daddy," she whispered. "It's waking up." Daniel felt his heart lurch. The cub's small limbs twitched, its nose wrinkling slightly. It didn't open its eyes, not yet, not fully, but it was trying. It was fighting. Daniel let out a slow breath, a shaky mix of relief and fear. It wasn't safe yet. Not even close. But it was alive. And that was something. Laura finally stepped forward, hesitant, her arms still wrapped tightly around herself. "What do we do now?" Her voice was quiet, but steady. Daniel looked at her, then back at the cub. Then, slowly, he turned toward the window. The mother bear's form was still there, dark and unmoving against the pale light. She was waiting. Waiting for him. Waiting to see if he would keep his promise. Daniel felt the weight of that choice settle deep in his chest. He had done what he could. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Not even close. And as he sat there, holding onto the fragile thread of life in his arms, he knew the hardest part was still ahead. The morning light was slow to rise, casting a pale glow across the yard, stretching long, golden fingers through the trees. The world outside had begun to stir, but inside the house, time had stood still. Daniel sat on the couch, unmoving. His fingers were still curled around the small, fragile body nestled against his chest. The cub had finally stopped trembling, its breaths deeper now, not strong, not certain, but steady enough to hold on to hope. His eyes were heavy, aching with exhaustion, but he hadn't slept. He couldn't. Not with what was waiting outside. Not with what had to happen next. He could feel it, the moment pressing in, suffocating, unavoidable. It was time. A movement near the window caught his eye. Laura. She was standing there, arms wrapped around herself, her gaze locked onto the yard beyond the glass. She hadn't slept either. Outside, the mother bear still lay in the grass. She hadn't moved all night. She hadn't tried to get up. She had just waited. Daniel swallowed against the thick knot in his throat. She was waiting for him. Or maybe she was waiting for the cub. His fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted the blanket wrapped around the tiny creature in his arms. It had warmed in the night, its body no longer stiff with the biting cold. But it was still weak, so weak. And yet, it had survived. Somehow, against every cruel reality of the world, against every law of nature that should have sealed its fate, it was still here. And now he had to give it back. The thought sent a sharp, splintering pain through his chest. He wasn't ready. He knew that sounded ridiculous. It wasn't his to keep, it never had been. But after everything, after the fight to save it, after the way it had trusted him, curled into his warmth, clung to him in the most vulnerable moments of its life, letting go felt impossible. He exhaled slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement might undo everything. Laura turned from the window, her gaze finding his. "It's time, isn't it?" she whispered. Daniel nodded. His throat was too tight to speak. Emma and Lily stood near the hallway, watching, their small hands clasped together as if letting go of each other might send them crumbling to the floor. Lily sniffled, her face crumpling into something Daniel didn't have the strength to look at for too long. "Do we have to?" she asked, her voice so small it nearly broke him in two. Daniel forced himself to smile. It was weak, barely there, but it was all he could give. "We have to." Emma blinked hard, her lip trembling. "But what if," she hesitated, her voice catching. "What if it doesn't make it out there?" Silence. Daniel's heart clenched painfully. It was a question he had been trying to shove out of his mind all night. Because the truth was, he didn't know. The cub had survived the night, but was that enough? Could it really make it out there? Could it really live without him? Or was he just sending it back into the cold, back into a world that might not be as forgiving next time? He didn't know. He would never know. And that was the hardest part. Laura stepped forward, kneeling in front of their daughters. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face before resting a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder. "Sweetheart," she murmured, her voice thick but steady, "he belongs out there. With her." Lily's small fists clenched. "But what if she's too sick?" she whispered. Laura blinked rapidly, her own pain slipping through the cracks in her composure. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, swallowing against the ache in his chest. Then he stood. The cub stirred slightly at the movement but didn't protest, simply shifting deeper into the warmth of the blanket. Daniel held it closer. And then he walked toward the door. Laura followed, and so did the girls, their small footsteps echoing behind him. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the door, he hesitated. Not because he doubted what he was doing, but because he didn't want this moment to end. But he had no choice. So he opened the door. The morning air hit him like a wall, crisp and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. And there she was. The mother bear. Still there. Still waiting. The sight of her nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. Her body was weak, her breathing uneven, but her eyes were alive. She had survived the night too. Daniel took a step forward. Then another. The cub stirred again, a soft noise escaping its tiny throat. The mother bear's ears twitched. She heard it. Daniel swore he saw something shift in her gaze. A spark of recognition. A flicker of hope. His hands trembled as he knelt down, lowering the cub to the earth. The little body curled into itself, confused by the sudden change, but it didn't fight him. It trusted him. Even now. Even as he let go. His fingers lingered for a moment. And then, slowly, carefully, he pulled away. The cub didn't move at first. It simply lay there, nestled in the folds of the blanket, its small body rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Daniel held his own breath, waiting. And then, the mother bear moved. It wasn't much. Just a shift of her massive frame, a slow, deliberate effort to lift her head, to see what had been placed before her. And Daniel watched as something passed between them. Something wordless. Ancient. Unbreakable. The cub whimpered softly. And then, it moved. First just a twitch of its tiny limbs. Then a shift. And then, with one final burst of fragile strength, it pushed itself up, wobbling unsteadily on its feet. Daniel's breath caught. The mother bear let out a sound, soft, low, something deep and instinctual. And the cub, slow, hesitant, moved toward her. Step by step. Inch by inch. Until, finally, it reached her. And she gathered it close. The sight nearly broke Daniel. His hands clenched into fists, his throat burning, his chest so full of something he couldn't name. Relief. Grief. Something between the two. Behind him, Lily sobbed softly. Emma clung to Laura's side, her face buried in her mother's sweater. Laura reached for Daniel's hand. He let her take it. And together, they watched the family reunite. Watched the mother get back what she thought she had lost. Watched a moment that was not theirs to understand, but one they would never forget. The mother bear curled protectively around her cub, pressing her nose against its small frame. Daniel let out a shaky breath. And then, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, he knew. It was time to walk away. The wind carried a heavy stillness, one that wrapped itself around Daniel's chest as he stood at the edge of the porch, watching. His breath came slow and deep, but the weight of the moment pressed against his ribs like an unseen force, anchoring him to the ground beneath his feet. In the clearing, the mother bear still lay curled around her cub. Their fur moved with the rhythmic rise and fall of slow, exhausted breaths, a gentle, fragile symphony of survival. Daniel had done what he could. He had stepped back, given them space. He had let nature take over. But he couldn't bring himself to walk away. Not yet. His hand still felt the warmth of the cub's small body. The memory of its weight against his chest, of its fragile heartbeat thrumming weakly beneath his fingers, refused to fade. It lingered in his bones, in the quiet spaces of his mind, in the raw place inside his heart where something irrevocable had shifted. Laura stood beside him, silent, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The girls had retreated inside, too overwhelmed to keep watching. Emma had tried, but her tears had come too fast, too hard, until she had crumbled into her mother's arms, shaking her head over and over. "I don't want to see them leave." Lily hadn't said anything at all. She had simply clutched Emma's hand, her face pale and unreadable, before disappearing inside with her sister. And now, it was just them. Daniel. Laura. And the fading presence of something that felt bigger than both of them. Daniel exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the bears. "They're not going to stay here," he murmured. Laura nodded, though her voice remained soft, distant. "I know. It was inevitable." The mother had found the strength to make it through the night, and now she had her cub back. There was nothing left for them here. The wild was calling them home. And yet, Daniel couldn't bring himself to feel relief. He should have. He should have been grateful that they had survived, that the cub had made it through, that the impossible choice he had made hadn't ended in heartbreak. But as he stood there, watching them, feeling the cold bite into his skin, all he could feel was the ache of goodbye. A part of him had wanted something else. Something irrational. Something that could never be. A part of him had wanted them to stay. He knew how foolish that was. He knew that this was the way it had to be. They belonged out there, beyond the trees, beyond the safety of fences and walls and human hands. But knowing didn't make it easier. Knowing didn't make it hurt less. The mother bear shifted. A slow, steady movement. Not rushed, not panicked. She was waking up fully now, her body still stiff with exhaustion but her instincts pushing her forward. Her ears flicked slightly, her eyes opening, and for the first time since she had collapsed in his yard, she lifted her head. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. She was looking at him. Not through him. At him. And in that single, impossible moment, something passed between them. Something Daniel couldn't explain. Not gratitude. Not relief. Something deeper. Something older. Something human and not human all at once. A kind of understanding that didn't need words. And then, just as slowly as she had lifted her head, she turned. Daniel's chest ached. Because he knew what was coming. The mother bear let out a low, soft sound, a deep, rumbling whisper of reassurance, and the cub stirred beneath her, stretching weakly before pressing itself closer against her fur. And then she stood. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't effortless. But it was happening. The sheer force of will it must have taken to push herself onto her feet, after everything, after nearly losing everything, left Daniel breathless. She took a step. Then another. And the cub, still weak, still unsteady, followed. Daniel clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists at his sides as he forced himself to stay still. He wanted to move. He wanted to reach out. But this was not his moment anymore. This was theirs. The mother bear hesitated for a fraction of a second, her body swaying slightly, her muscles trembling from the effort. But then she let out another low sound, gentler, reassuring. The cub responded immediately. It took a shaky step forward, its small paws pressing into the cold earth. Then another. Daniel's heart pounded. He wanted to look away. He couldn't. The mother bear turned slightly, her gaze lingering for the briefest of moments. And then she walked. Into the trees. Into the wild. And her cub followed. Daniel didn't move. Laura didn't either. They just stood there, frozen, watching as the two figures slipped between the trees, their dark bodies blending into the shifting light of the forest. Until finally, they were gone. The wind rustled through the trees, filling the silence they left behind. And Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. And yet, it wasn't. Because as he stood there, staring at the empty space where they had been, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle deep into his bones, he knew something had changed. Something in him. Something in all of them. Emma and Lily would grow up remembering this. Not just the bears. Not just the fear. But the choice. The moment their father had stepped forward instead of turning away. The moment they had learned that sometimes the right thing isn't easy. Sometimes it's terrifying. Sometimes it's a risk. But sometimes it's the only thing that matters. Daniel let out a slow breath, his gaze still locked on the woods. They made it, Laura murmured beside him. He nodded. And for the first time, he let himself believe it. Then, without another word, without another glance at the trees, he turned and walked inside. Because even though this chapter had ended, he knew. This story would never leave him. It would live in him. Forever.